The 70s were a time of massive upheaval for the film industry. On one hand, the sheer amount of political dissonance going on was throwing preconceived ideas about what would play with audiences into question. And on the other, the growing popularity of home television sets was having a huge impact on film viewing demographics. Up until that point, Hollywood had been ruled by the Hays Code, also known as the Motion Picture Production Code. The Hays Code had been a set of moral guidelines for the film industry, written up by the Postmaster General of Indiana, William Hays, in 1922. However, many of the code's contents had become severely outdated in its almost 60 years of existence, and by the early 70s, most major film studios had begun to slowly phase it out. The primary movie-going demographic had become college students, many of whom were queer. In previous decades, this hadn't mattered to film producers. The Hays Code forbade sexual perversion of any kind, which included positive depictions of queer people. While many of the people who worked in Hollywood were queer, the system operated on a don't ask, don't tell policy. Representation had to be coded, implied. Overt depictions of homosexuality were saved for villains and degenerates. However, in June of 1969, a spontaneous police raid on the Stonewall Inn, a New York gay bar, led to fights between the bar's patrons and the police, which spiraled into massive public rioting. The riots and their resulting media coverage shone a spotlight on the long-forsaken queer community, and protests against anti-gay police brutality broke out across the country. Gay rights was a hot-button issue, and not only were independent queer filmmakers becoming emboldened to make films that reflected their experiences, but mainstream film producers were eager to profit off of queer audiences. One of the earliest examples of a mainstream gay film is 1970's Boys in the Band. Based on the off-Broadway play of the same name, Boys in the Band was an ensemble film centering around a group of gay men attempting to throw a party for their friend. As the night goes on and with the introduction of Alan, a straight man, the party gets uglier and uglier as secrets and self-loathing bubble to the surface. The film serves as a perfect time capsule of early gay films. It attempts to reconcile the sense of community many queer people felt with their own sense of internal and external tragedy. While the early 70s did produce films like Cabaret and Pink Narcissus, which presented homosexuality in either a positive or matter-of-fact light, many films that came out of this time period were sobering internal reflections of what it meant to be a homosexual. However, it didn't stay this way. As the decade went on, filmmakers became more and more comfortable depicting queer people in a variety of situations. Movies could still be and have sobering reflections of reality, but as further progress was made in the real world, the narrow space occupied by the gays had begun to broaden. Films like Le Cage Falls and Rocky Horror Picture Show were perfectly content with being fun, raucous films. Not every story had to be tragic. However, change was looming on the horizon. At the same time many of these films were being made, the first whispers about a disease then known as GRID, or gay-related immune deficiency, were beginning to spread. As the 70s became the 80s, the handful of known GRID-related deaths began to multiply. The disease was crudely referred to by some as gay cancer, as it seemed to primarily affect gay men. Conservative politicians used the growing publicity as a talking point. Being gay was unnatural, and this was the natural order taking its revenge. GRIDS, or as it was now known, AIDS, was a punishment from God. The production of queer films began to stagnate. Many gay filmmakers who'd been fairly active in the 70s were either becoming sick or were mourning for the friends and loved ones they'd lost to AIDS. President Reagan would not even say the word AIDS until 1985, and wouldn't mention it in an official address until 1987. As the 80s raged on and the government continued to drag its feet in response to the public health crisis, gay filmmakers began to come out of the woodwork with films reflecting their experiences with AIDS. One of the earlier films in this regard was Parting Glances, which starred Steve Buscemi as a man in his late 20s dying of AIDS. Much like Boys in the Band, the film managed to be both witty and fun while also providing a sober reflection of what it meant to be gay in 1980s America. At the time, there was no cure for AIDS, it was a death sentence. And the film followed the various loved ones of Nick, Buscemi's character, attempting to deal with the reality that their friend was going to die, and there was nothing they could do about it, all while trying to live their lives as normally as they can. Parting Glances was certainly not the first film to tackle this topic, but it was one of the best and earliest. As the 80s began to near its end, more and more films were coming out that attempted to comprehend the scope and impact of the AIDS crisis, which was a monstrous task for any one film to do. By that point, almost a decade of progress had been lost, and thousands were dead. Films like Longtime Companion attempted to communicate the impact by depicting its long-term societal consequences, showing how it affects several characters' lives over the course of the 80s. Whereas films like An Early Frost attempted to take a more intimate, family drama-driven approach. On top of these films, you had numerous plays, like The Normal Heart, Falsettos, and most famously, Angels in America, which also attempted to put a human face on a massive public health crisis. And many of these plays would later go on to be adapted theatrically. Not all queer films from the 80s were reflections on the AIDS crisis. Notable standouts are movies like My Beautiful Laundrette, a drama comedy which discussed the taboos of both gay and interracial relationships, as well as the rise of white nationalism in 1980s Britain. And Morris, based on the 1913 E.M. Forrester book of the same name, which examines the life of its title character Morris Hall, a white, upper-middle-class man, how he comes to terms with his own sexuality, and how that affects his life. I realize in hindsight that summary makes it sound like a really boring movie. It is one of my favorite movies of all time. It's really good. Please watch it. Please watch both of them. Do it! By the 90s, Hollywood had once again begun to warm up to the idea of mainstream gay films. While most of the big, high-profile ones were still dramas about the AIDS crisis, like Philadelphia, starring Tom Hanks, there were some more indie outliers. Notable examples include films like My Own Private Idaho and The Watermelon Woman, both of which are very indicative of 90s queer cinema. My Own Private Idaho is a loose retelling of Shakespeare's Henry IV, starring Keanu Reeves and River Phoenix as two young, gay prostitutes. The film is beautiful and somewhat surreal, with the retelling almost taking a backseat to Phoenix's character's story, which has nothing to do with Shakespeare. Rather, his character is a wholly unique one, who suffers from crippling narcolepsy and is driven by a desire to find his estranged mother. Reeves, on the other hand, plays the stand-in for young Prince Hal. He's the son of the mayor, incredibly wealthy and privileged, and yet he engages in seriously dangerous sex work, seemingly viewing it as just a thing to do, a way to live on the wild side for a few years before he has to grow up and become an adult. The film is especially notable, however, not for any of these elements, but for being the first ever mainstream gay film where two men say "I love you" on screen. The Watermelon Woman, on the other hand, is a much more down-to-earth film about the history of black and queer people's place in media, particularly film. It follows Cheryl, played by Cheryl Dunya, a black lesbian working in a video store, attempting to chronicle the life and history of a black lesbian actress from the 40s. The film deals very heavily with taboo subjects, like Hollywood's past and current racial stereotyping, the intentional misrepresentation of queer people's identities throughout history, the backlash people in interracial relationships can face, as well as various other heavy topics. The film was incredibly controversial, with Representative Peter Hoekstra, chairman of the House Education and Workforce Committee's United States Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, using it as an example of why the government shouldn't be funding programs like the National Endowment for the Arts, which provided a significant portion of the film's funding, basically arguing that the film constituted gay pornography. There were also projects like the famous documentary Paris is Burning, which explored the lives of Black, Latinx, and trans queer people living and working in the drag ball scene of late 80s New York. In comparison to films like Philadelphia or My Own Private Idaho, which even at the grungiest or most indie still looked polished and well-funded, Paris is Burning peeled back the curtain to show what the real lives of most queer people were like. The film is at times very bleak, with frank discussions about the racism, poverty, and sexual violence many of these people face. However, it also contains messages of hope, and depictions of a tight-knit and supportive community. In 2016, the film was added to the National Film Registry by the Library of Congress. The late 80s and early 90s had been dominated by dramas about the experiences of queer people. However, by the mid-90s, gay representation was no longer as controversial as it had been, and the worst of the AIDS crisis had passed. We began to see more mainstream comedic films with gay themes. While there were still gay dramas being produced, like Beautiful Thing and Edge of 17, they were cut from a very different cloth than previous films of that nature, primarily focusing on the experiences of coming out. However, the films most people, gay, straight or otherwise, remember from this decade, are typically the more upbeat gay comedies like The Birdcage, and In and Out. Films like In and Out were received well because of their generally inoffensive depictions of gay men, portraying the experience of being gay more about interests and mannerisms than sexual or romantic attraction to men. And films like The Birdcage, a modern American adaptation of Le Cage aux Folles, were popular because they portrayed gay men in a sympathetic light while also taking potshots at gay culture and playing with stereotypes. Comparably speaking, these films are far more well-remembered by most people than films like But I'm a Cheerleader, a comedy made for gay audiences by gay filmmakers. The early 2000s were an odd time for queer films. On one hand, there was a significant increase in audiences' willingness to view films with gay characters. On the other, there was also a significant increase in political discourse surrounding issues of gay marriage. These two distinct changes in the way audiences, primarily straight audiences, interacted with queer media, led to an influx of gay dramas, to the point where it almost became a joke. Which is not to say that there were no light-hearted gay films, but in the wake of the AIDS crisis and with modern homophobia becoming a matter of legal debate, even gay comedies typically had dramatic bents to them. Films like Big Eden, one of the first ever gay rom-coms done in the traditional Hollywood style, never explicitly mention homophobia, but there are a lot of very obvious, unsaid implications. When it's revealed that Big Eden's elderly residents simply want to help the two main, male characters get together, we as an audience are clearly supposed to react with some level of surprise. There were very obvious steps being taken by many members of the media to help Americans less likely to come into contact with the gay community understand gay experiences. This was done both as a legitimate gesture of goodwill and as a way to capitalize off faux gay audiences. TV shows like the original Queer Eye and Queer as Folk helped present a down-to-earth, accessible image of modern gay men to straight, middle American audiences, while also providing younger queer kids with a point of reference for their own identity and experiences. But, on the other end of the spectrum, you had an increase in gay dramas. Films like Mysterious Skin, Boy Culture, and Latter Days all attempted to portray modern or historically recent homophobia in the most distinctive and brutal way it could. However, the undisputed king of these early 2000s gay dramas was Brokeback Mountain, based on the short story by Annie Proulx. Brokeback Mountain was a high-budget gay drama set in the mid-60s and starring Jake Gyllenhaal and Heath Ledger as two Midwestern ranchers, and chronicles their lifelong on-again off-again relationship. It was a highly emotional and visually breathtaking film, winning numerous different awards and eventually being added to the National Film Registry by the Library of Congress. Famously, Brokeback was nominated for Best Picture at the 78th Academy Awards but lost to the racial drama Crash. The film had been largely expected to win, and its loss, coupled with the fact that none of the other gay films nominated, such as Capote, the Truman Capote biopic starring Philip Seymour Hoffman, helped draw attention to systemic homophobia in Hollywood. In many ways, Brokeback Mountain is the premier example of early 2000s gay films. It is a movie written and directed by straight people, starring two conventionally attractive straight actors, clearly made not just to titillate or tug at the heartstrings of gay audiences, but straight as well. It's a beautiful and moving film, but it's also one with a complicated legacy for many queer people.